Hi. Good afternoon. Our final session on Mill. The other things, the stuff on Buchanan that you missed, I posted a little explaining thing on Canvas. So both the slides of all courses will be there, as well as these recordings. Today also I posted the rough outline of the essay question that you can expect for Thursday. And don't forget to bring your blue book, as always. So what we're going to be doing today then is to discuss our final reading on intervention, which is by John Stuart Mill. That's one of the first ever sort of philosophically informed discussions of military intervention that we know of. Even before Mill, there were plenty of cases in which philosophers wrote about military invasions and conquest and things like that, but intervention hadn't really been discussed yet until later in the 19th century, when you get, in part as an outgrowth of the colonial approaches that countries like Great Britain were undertaking. It was sort of like a civilizing mission. So the Brits thought of themselves as a great nation. The sun never sets on the British Empire, so across the globe, spanning the globe. And part of the justification that was told for why the empire was supposed to be a good idea was that there were these less civilized nations across the world that the Brits were basically educating, trying to bring up to the level of civilization. The white man's burden, if you remember from Kipling. So one of the things that people were saying that started happening in the same period is that if you take that responsibility seriously, is that sometimes when there is local oppression or foreign oppression or a civil war going on in other countries, that maybe instead of occupying them and civilizing them, you could have intervention and sort of thereby liberate a country, set it free. And Mill was generally did not take very kindly to that idea. He did think in some ways the empire was defensible, but just intervention he thought was not. So the piece that hopefully you've read for today is his argument for why interventions in general are not justifiable. As you've seen, Mill actually takes an approach to this that sidesteps some of the different things that we've read. He is not talking about self-determination as much. He is talking about slightly different topics. He has different reasons for why he thinks intervention is a bad idea. And so we'll get to that. More pragmatic, if you will. All right, so here's just a quick bit of background. When reading Mill, you'll see he distinguishes between two types of questions. He thinks there's one set of questions about what is the ethical way that so-called civilized nations should behave towards each other. And so what he has in mind is sort of roughly your sort of European countries, right, and the United States, I guess. So how Britain should interact with France and with the United States and with the Netherlands, say, or whatever, like these. That's one issue, he says. But then there is a further question, and that is a different one, which is what to do with nations that are not civilized, but what he calls barbaric nations. So there's a sort of a two-tier split that he thinks exists in the world: the civilized world and the not-so-civilized world. And you can see the justification of empire shining through, right? The civilized world then can be justified in occupying and colonizing the uncivilized world, and then bringing civilization to them, hopefully thereby lifting them up to the civilized level. So there's no nice way of putting this. Mill's views here are terrible, right? There's just no way. These are the kind of things that are fortunately mostly a part of our past, but they were very much accepted. I mean, Mill was a member of parliament. He still is one of the greatest political philosophers that has lived. Despite these views, he had many, many really deep and important philosophical insights. He was a main contributor to ethics, to theory of logic, to economics. He wrote the main textbook of economics of his time, to history. He wrote an autobiography that is still considered to be sort of a prime literary piece. So a man of very, very great accomplishments. One of the first defenders of women's rights. So not someone who you can just sort of dismiss as an idiot by any means, but did have views that we now consider to be very deeply misguided and heinous, and correctly so, I think. But when you read it, you'll see that, right? And so my point in drawing your attention to this is to just to recognize that this was very much a part of the elite view of the time. That Mill was not some type of exception in the British intellectual and political elites. That was the standard. That was very much standard fare. A, but also B, to make a point that is a philosopher's point, which is in some ways we should separate the man from the ideas, right, or the woman from the ideas. Even if you think that Mill as a person had some questionable characteristics, at least in this regard. Maybe not. People are as complicated as ideas are, so probably, like most of us, he had better and worse sides. But even if if he had some ideas that were crappy, some of the other ideas might still be interesting. And we're discussing it not because we want to somehow worship Mill the man or whatever. We want to discuss this because we're interested in the argument, and the argument can stand by itself. It's just Mill wrote it down. See?
So, what would you define as the problem with his views on how civilized countries and nations deal with each other versus how civilized countries deal with barbaric nations? Is that like a biased view, or what's wrong?
Can you be a little more explicit? I'm not sure what you're asking me.
He said that his views are pretty crappy, and are you talking about those two views alone?
Okay. Well, so there's the piece. He says, there's relations. So Britain, of course, is always like this, right? Whenever people have a hierarchy, right? Some things are more important than the other. Then, almost without exception, they themselves are in the class that's the more important one, right? So Britain is going to be among the civilized nations because he was in Britain, right? And so it's other countries that are the barbaric ones. Right? Yeah, so like India, Pakistan, the places. Egypt is talking about the Suez Canal conflict, which was the direct cause of writing that. You can be assured that all of Africa would be lumped into this. Most of Latin America, I'm sure, right? Central America, I'm pretty sure he would classify like that too. So these are, he's not exactly naming them, but that's standard fare at the time. So what's the crappy part, I think, is this, the way that Mill draws a distinction is he says, look, ethics really, the ethics of relations between states, the international relations, it imposes restrictions on us, like restrictions of non-aggression or non-intervention, only when we're dealing with other civilized nations, not when we're dealing with these barbaric nations. With them, more or less everything goes, and it doesn't mean just anything goes and just like rape, murder, and pillage them. He didn't think that was what you should be doing. He really thought you should be civilizing these people, and you should try and treat them with concern for their well-being and get them up to the level. But you can't trust them. That's the basic idea. So so the French you can have a treaty with, right? Because the French they're rational and they're self-constrained and so on. And so when they say to you okay, we won't attack you just because we're angry or something, right? You can trust them because they have that type of composure. But these barbaric people, they're not quite there yet. So you can't trust them to really follow rules and make promises that are you can see these sort of stereotypical ideas about the Indian nations who were very passionate, not trustworthy. Any type of weird slide will be taken as an act of war, and then you think you have a peace treaty, and then you get attacked, and these type of cartoonish descriptions. That's part of what he thinks barbaric nations are like. And so you can't have a rule of non-intervention with them because you can't trust them. But with the French, you can. Right. Well, what we're going to ask is whether what he's saying should be true between England and France is a good idea for countries that are relatively equal, right? Right. What I think is crappy, and I think most people think is crappy, is the idea that there are certain people, certain ethnicities, certain nations in the world that are sort of just inherently untrustworthy or inherently irrational or stupid or something, uncivilized. And so the Brits are not, like I'm not, right? But you, of course, right? You are the lower one. That thought is pretty. It's a little stupid. Right. Sure. Yeah. Anthony J.
Was this during the time that India was being like kind of regulated by Britain, like during Gandhi's lifetime?
Gandhi's later, I think, but Gandhi's during the independence movement. But this is before that. But yeah, England had a long-standing presence in India. At the time, India was considered part of the British Empire. So anyway, my point is this: he has some unsavory things to say about these barbaric nations. Thinks that people everywhere count equally. He's not denying that. He's not saying you can just kill Indian people or something, right? He was a utilitarian, one of the most famous utilitarians. And utilitarianism is a very simple theory. It says everybody counts equally, and so you have to take everybody's well-being equally into account. It's really demanding if you take that seriously, right? You have to really care as much about the Indian people as you have to care about your own. But as a nation, so when we think about them together as a collective, it's different because they're not really capable of being ethical. And so he'll say this stuff, right? Barbarians will not reciprocate, cannot be dependent on observing any rules. They just don't have the rationality or the self-composure or something. Minds are not capable of so great an effort, nor is there... Now, this is... I mean, if you're looking for like a nice statement of racism, right? This is... Here you get it, right? So, no two ways about it. That's just pretty bad. But if we set aside as a philosopher now, right, we recognize that's crap. Ignore it, right? Let's not spend our time thinking about it too much. Think about the other part of what he's saying. So we can just drop from his theory the idea that there are these barbaric nations. Say, well, what if we live in a world without barbaric nations? Right? We have people that are equals, and Indian people are no less capable of observing rules or ethical conduct than British people and American people. If we accept that view, we just used his idea about what's true between the English and the French, and we just apply that across the world. Would that be a good idea? Right? So just get rid of the easy mistakes, and then ask, what about the more, is that more interesting? So that's what we're going to be. So I'm not going to be talking anything anymore about the racism. Just say, that's bullshit, let's get rid of it. We'll ignore it from now on, because that's the best you can do with this stuff. Just ignore it. Anyway. Philosophically, anyway. And then ask, is he right about intervention between these civilized nations? So, for us, all nations. All right. So, here's how Mill begins the essay, right? He says, he understands the impulse, right? He begins by saying, I actually understand, I see the call for interventionism. He says, there's much to be said for the doctrine that a nation should be willing to assist its neighbors in throwing off oppression and gaining free institutions. The idea being that being free, having oppressive institutions thrown out, that's definitely a plus. That's a good thing. It's much better to live in a free country than in an oppressed country or a colonized country or whatever. And he does think we should care about how well our neighbors are doing. It's not that he doesn't care about other people. But at the same time, he thinks the Brits, who are generally non-interventionist at the time, say that's actually better than the more interventionist countries. And so, at least in the negative part of international morality, it means it's the non-interference part. So he says, we Brits were often told we should be more interventionist by the people who say, well, if you really care about the Syrians, you should be intervening, for example, right, today. And he says, yeah, you should care, but that actually means still you should not be an interventionist power. And so the argument is going to be an argument for why you should be against interventionism, but it won't, he's announcing it right at the beginning, right? He won't say that he's against interventionism because the interests of foreigners don't matter. It's not because you don't have a responsibility to make sure that your neighbors are better off or living in freedom or so on. So he's not going to just doubt that beginning premise. It's a different type of argument. In some ways, he's going to say that the most humanitarian thing you can do is to not intervene rather than to intervene. All right. So there's different kinds of intervention that he discusses. These are three that he at least talks about. So military interventions to aid domestic struggles for freedom. Right? So you have a revolution going on in a country where the people are trying to overthrow oppressive powers within their own country. You can have an intervention to add domestic struggles for liberty against a foreign oppression. So when one country invades another, for example, and the people are trying to get their freedom, then you might intervene on behalf of them. And then there is the civil war. You might think if there's a civil war going on, that you can intervene on behalf of one side or the other. So you might extend this, by the way. He doesn't talk about this explicitly, but you might extend this slightly further into some things that we've seen in our lifetime. Things about regime change, right? So even if there is no real domestic oppression going on, or domestic revolt going on, no struggle for liberty is going on, you might still throw off a domestic oppressor or a foreign oppressor or whatever. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list, by the way. There might be further cases. For example, if you remember from Buchanan, Buchanan discusses cases of secession, right, where you have two different groups living in one state, and they want to separate. And he thinks you can, on behalf of their self-determination, intervene to let them separate if they can't do it themselves. So you might think that this list has to be, if we're going to be exhaustive, continue down. Anyway, insofar as Mill discusses things, he only thinks that intervention can ever be justified in cases like B and only some cases of C. So he thinks only when there is a foreign oppressor and you can throw that one out, intervention can be justified, or in particular kinds of civil wars. Not most civil wars you shouldn't intervene, he thinks, but only those that are what he calls protracted, basically a civil war that's been going on for years and years and years, gets very bloody, and there's a kind of a stalemate that the two powers keep themselves balanced and not one or the other is actually going to win. Then maybe you intervene. Because this is just going to be bloodshed, and bloodshed involves a lot of pain. Pain is bad for a utilitarian, right? So then you might have a reason to do it. But not just any civil war. If there was just a civil war and you think, well, over time one side or the other is going to win, then you should stay out. And if you're just dealing with an ordinary revolution, you should stay out. Tamir? Yeah, we'll probably... Yeah, good. It's a good question, because it connects to some of the reasons he's going to give. I mean, probably he's going to... It depends if one or the other side is committed to upholding a certain type of freedom that he cares about, right? If one of them does, then you would intervene on behalf of them. Another option would be to split them up, right? Try to see if they're living in separate parts of the country, you might split them up and just divide the country into two. That would be a possibility. But yeah, it's going to matter in part because of what's to come. So, see?
So, Mill allows for intervention in cases of being some protracted?
Yeah, like these long grinding stalemate type civil wars, where there's just yeah, and it doesn't look like one side or the other is ever, or maybe if there are more than two sides, any of the sides is actually going to be powerful enough to win by itself. So, like, if you think about the American Civil War, right? So, like, the North was winning, then you shouldn't intervene as an outside country on behalf, even of the North or the South. Just you should let it play out. He thinks. But if it was going to be, trying to think of a case of like a really long-standing civil war, maybe like Somalia or something. Right? It's like 1991 is when there was already civil war going on there, then when the intervention happened, and it's still pretty much going on. So we're coming close to about 30 years of civil war. At that point, maybe intervention can become justifiable. He thinks, because it's just this is just going to continue causing bloodshed.
And then what I got from the article that I read on Canvas, like, he said that one of his reasons for, I don't know if I'm just getting this right, but one of his reasons for not allowing intervention is if the person who is intervening isn't getting any benefit from it, like commercial benefit, like money.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's not going to be beneficial to them, then no reason for them to help out.
Well, I mean, one of the things he says in the beginning is maybe that's what you're talking about. He's sort of critical of how people defend more interventionist countries. And he points out that sometimes when countries intervene in other countries, they don't do it for the humanitarian reasons, but they do it to profit. Right? So, I believe this has been largely discredited, but anyway, at the time of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, lots of people said, well, they were really going in for the oil. Reason why I think it's discredited is that the war was way more expensive than the difference in the prices in oil would be. But anyway, that's the type of reasoning, right? Where you might think, well, you might make a claim about, we're spreading democracy, but you're really after the oil. Right? So in those cases, Mill thinks sometimes that might be true, and then it's not humanitarian intervention at all what you're praising. Right? So he says that he thinks the UK forgoes these type of benefits. Right? He likes the UK, he likes Great Britain very much here because he thinks we don't intervene for benefit. We don't because we're humanitarians, we stay out. That's it. So he's trying to set up the contrast a little more favorable to himself, I guess, by pointing to how the interventionist camp sometimes has not so nice motivations as well. Yeah.
During one of the parts near the end of the article, he was talking about it's also a good idea to intervene if there's a civil war going on and another country comes in to try to help one side, then it's okay for another foreign country to intervene in the foreign country that is putting themselves in it. He was talking about, I think, England and Russia.
Say that again? Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's like a civil war with Hungary, or like a war with Hungary,
mm-hmm.
and Russia was trying to back up one of the sides, and it said that England should have intervened against Russia just ahead of time instead of waiting until it was after, and then they ended up in like some war or something themselves.
Trying to place what you're saying.
If there's a civil war going on and a foreign country tries to jump into it, then it's okay for another foreign country to intervene against the foreign country.
Right, good, yes. So in those cases, he thinks it's going to be a case of B, right? Where it's, so if what the Russians are doing is not actually engaging in a correct intervention that is supposed to lead to the society becoming free and peaceful again, but they're trying to occupy it or have their henchmen in place or something, right? In those cases, those cases, really what is happening is you get a foreign oppressor subjecting another people, and that's a case in which you can at least start thinking about intervention. Claudia?
Doesn't he say at some point that intervention to enforce non-intervention is always okay?
Right, yeah, so that's basically the argument, one of the arguments behind why the foreign oppression thing is a good idea, right? So it's a kind of, if you remember all the way in the beginning of this section, we talked about the Westphalian idea that was that international law really is a law of non-intervention at all, non-aggression. And so the only reasons for using military force then are to stop other people from who are first using military force. And so that fits in very nicely, right? So the example from my lifetime, maybe not yours, but my lifetime anyway, was the early 1990s Iraq invasion of Kuwait. Right? And so the elder George Bush went in, sending the military of the U.S. to throw out the Iraqis out of Kuwait and liberate it again. So that would be an example that Mill would be favorable to. So.
Isn't that also when he agrees with Walter? It's the same thing that it's like in the Civil War, if like a third party enters, then you're also enter?
Yeah, there's a number of similarities between Walter and Mill. Yeah, they'll be fine.
So when you would intervene in a situation like we've just talked about, would you like, okay, take for example in Syria where the Russians say they're attacking ISIS, but I mean they're bombing the hospitals with the rebels and all sorts of stuff, and they're helping the Assad regime. Like everybody knows that they're not just attacking ISIS. It just doesn't match reality. Would they say that we should take acts against Russia, as in go to war with Russia almost, or just maybe shoot down the Russian jets that are bombing the Syrian civilians?
So I think, we're engaging in extrapolation now, right? We're sort of asking what given Mill's arguments would you expect this theory to say about a case like this? Right? So with some trepidation. But what I think he would say is that, look, intervention, if it's going to be justified, is going to be justified in just these type of cases, when it has a good shot of leading to freedom. So a transition from a tyranny or oppression to a freer and stable, so maybe like a democracy or something. So in those cases, the Russians are intervening on behalf of one oppressor against another oppressing regime, or would-be oppressing regime. Right? I don't think he would see much cause for intervening on behalf of one or the other. You could enforce, of course, non-aggression if you think that the Russians are being this is just not an intervention. This is just plain old warfare. Then you can try and force them back if you want to police them. But then you have to start asking yourself, well, what are the chances of success? How many people are you going to kill? What are benefits might you expect, and so on, right? There's going to be a whole utilitarian calculus then that you have to go through. But there wouldn't really be a good cause for intervention, I don't think, for Mill, because none of the sides involved that we're mentioning is particularly committed to what he thinks is the end goal, right? So a free society. So in those cases, probably he thinks you'd best stay out of it. That's my guess. Yeah, Claudia?
Yeah, I think with his example, he took the Hungary Austria situation. Well, Hungary was part of Austria, but they wanted to be free. And so I think what he said is it would not be okay for England to help Hungary, like just out of be like, okay, you want to be free, so we're going to help you, we're going to intervene. But then Russia said they would help Austria keep Hungary in their empire, and at that point it would have been okay for England to say, well, no, we're going to help Hungary. I don't think he said they would have to actually intervene or go to war, but just by saying, okay, Russia, if you help Austria, we're going to help Hungary. That way you could keep both of them out and have the actual country.
Right.
So I think that's what I understood of it. But he doesn't actually want to go to it. He shouldn't intervene in actual violence, but by being on one side, or you're saying if one other third party intervenes, then you would intervene. You can keep the whole situation.
Right, and so at least if it came to it, like if they actually do go in, and you think you can actually make it the case that the Hungarians would achieve freedom, then maybe you should also, you at least be justified in also going in. But what he's doing, right, he's trying to say, like, well, that is maybe one of the few cases, but all the other cases, I'm going to say no, 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 and then maybe in these cases where you can really make a difference in actually transitioning these people to freedom, then yes. And that's going to be that's sort of the recurring theme through his arguments, right? He's pretty pessimistic about just the ability of outside interveners to actually change a country, to put it in, like, really liberate a country, really make it into a free society. He thinks most of the time, so definitely in the cases of D, we'll see in a second, but also in cases of A, where you have just these domestic revolutions, he thinks if intervention is needed to make this happen, to make freedom happen, then it's going to fail, basically. He thinks this won't work out, and then you've just killed people for no good reason. So stay out. So, we'll work our way back. We'll start with the easy case, right? So, he doesn't talk about regime change any in any direct sense, but we can, if we look at what he would say, I think, about the regime change, it'll become easier to understand the arguments throughout. So, here's a quote. This is a pretty famous quote by Mill. Sometimes infamous. Tissan, for example, really gets some mileage out of attacking this part of Mill. Anyway, here's what he writes. So the only test possessing any real value of a people become fit for popular institutions, so it would be like some type of democracy, right? Is that they, or a sufficient portion of them, say for the, I'm just going to use it, the majority for now, but whatever the sufficient portion is, to prevail in the contest, are willing to brave labor and danger for their liberation. All right, quick question. What does he mean? What's his point here? It's a long sentence. Shut down. Right. So if you have to put it in a snappy way, in your own words, how would you summarize the idea? Right. So the only way you know that a country is ready to be free is if people are willing to fight for it. Right. That's more or less the idea. Say, was that where you had in mind? Yeah.
Countries have to be strong and willing to put their life on the line in order to show that they're fit to be a country.
Right. Good. So here's another part of this, right? So if a people does not value, it would be freedom, he says, but freedom sufficiently to fight for it, and maintain it against any force which can be mustered within the country, even by those who have the command of the public revenue, it is only a question in how few years or months that people will be enslaved. Either the government which it has given to itself, or some military leader, or knot of conspirators who contrive to subvert the government will speedily put an end to all popular property institutions. What's the point here? What do you think he's trying to get at here?
If the people aren't willing to fight for their freedom and fight for a change in itself, then they're going to be easily overthrown by a government or a group of people that are trying to take over the government and then control the people, to where the people aren't going to rebel against the government because they're too weak.
Right, yeah, a knot of conspirators, right? I've never heard that one. But, yeah, right, so he thinks somehow, like democracies need defending, right, from those who would turn them into tyrannies, or who would seize the power for themselves, right? And so it's basically an idea of sort of like power corrupts, right? So like there are power-hungry people out there, and that might be just this knot of conspirators, right? It might be some military leader, right? It might be the government that you elect, right? in any case, there's going to be these people who are going to threaten to overthrow the democracy and put it into something that's not a democracy, that is a denial of freedom, an oppressive government. And the only thing that will stop them is that they can't get away with it. Right? That's basically his thought. So that the people of the society prevent them, won't let them take power. And so you need a lot of people to do that, right? And you need to have them to have some kind of vigilance. Unless that's there, you can put in place a democracy, you put in place a constitution, have elections and everything, but if that's not in place, then it's only a question not maybe a few years or maybe just months, right, before the whole thing will come undone again. Ultimately, I think this is what really motivates Mill when he's talking about the relations between civilized nations and interventions. He thinks that you cannot intervene in just these domestic struggles because if there's not enough people to support freedom, well, it'll be pointless. You just go in, kill a bunch of people, lose lives yourself, and it won't help. You'll just throw out one set of oppressors in favor of another. But he thinks when you have this sort of this very evenly matched civil war, so there is no way in which you can figure out whether there is a big enough people that will be committed to freedom because they're being exactly held in check by the other group, or when there is an outside force that is overwhelming them, that's so powerful, right? So like Iraq was much stronger, much bigger than Kuwait. It's a very tiny nation. So Iraq marches into to Kuwait. Well, you can't then say, well, unless these Kuwaitis are strong enough to throw out the Iraqis, because the power difference is so big. Right? And if the power difference is so big, well, then you can come in on behalf of the Kuwaitis, throw out the Iraqis, and say, okay, well, they'll be free. They'll keep their freedom because enough of them are committed to it. On the assumption that Kuwait is free, but whatever. You get my point. Right. Is this clear, this idea or not? Yeah, same.
Yeah, basically what I got from Mill's views on regime change is that if a certain group of people are willing to fight for the freedom, then they deserve to have their own country or whatever, or establishment / popular institution. But if they're not willing to fight for the freedom and put their lives on the line, then they're going to continue to be enslaved by their oppressors.
Right.
And they'll make sure that they have all efforts to answer speedily. They'll completely put an end to all popular institutions.
Right. Yeah. So the one thing I'd say that's a good summary. The one thing I don't think for Mill it's a question of whether people deserve it or not. It's just that he thinks it's not feasible. It won't work unless you have enough people committed to it. Right. So I think in principle, everyone who would be willing to support it would deserve it. I think for him, because he thinks freedom is better than oppression. But, all right. Right. Yeah. Of course. Then, except if you're black or brown or like whatever. Right. Basically, that's the. Well, it's civilized. Yeah. Right. We have to get you to the point where you're rational enough and mature enough to be an ethical. Yeah. So that's the nastiness.
I don't know if this coincides with it, but it reminds me of the Algeria-Sweden example.
Yeah. What? So it reminds you of the Walter example with the chemical between the Swedes and the Algerians. How is that exactly?
Let's see. So he said the barbaric nations need to be civilized, and they can't follow ethical standards. So they need civilized countries to make them civilized. And then for Algeria-Sweden example, if Algeria is going through civil turmoil and problems within the country, they would be considered as a barbaric nation. And then Sweden, if they just implanted this chemical that would make them act like Sweden is more civilized, then that would be an example of intervention. I forgot who was against. Somebody was against that. Wasn't it Walter against that? Or
Yeah, Walter is against the chemical being used. Yeah.
because of their right to self-determination.
Right. So Walter thinks that the Algerians, even though they are behaving in a morally worse way, right, because they're engaging in human rights violations at the time, still, they still have a right against even a non-harmful chemical being used. Right? So then he thinks, even stronger, they have a right against harmful military means being used. Right? But so that's a difference between Walter and Mill, right? Mill would think, well, they're not really capable of having rights because they're not ethical people, right? And that's why they need to be colonized, civilized, and then the idea always was, at least in writing, or at least in speaking, right? The formal story was, well, empire is a temporary thing. Right? So once the civilizing mission is completed, then they'll be ready for self-government, and we'll go. We just never got to the point where the Brits thought the time had come, until they were forced. So, I mean, honestly, probably someone like Mill believed this sincerely, right? But plenty of people, I'm sure, also had serious economic stakes and political power involved in the continuing of the empire, and so for them, using that type of rhetoric was dishonest. But I don't see any reason for thinking that Mill wasn't sincere when he said that. Doesn't make it any better, but he at least, I think, wasn't just I don't think he was just lying to cover up for his own political agenda or his economic gain or something. Whatever that's worth. Not very much. All right. So that's why he wouldn't allow for just plain old regime change, right? So you go into, so Mill would have said, for example, with the 2003 Iraq invasion, bad idea because there's not a lot of people there fighting for their freedom right now. So Bush Jr., you can go in and put a democracy in place, but it's just going to unravel for the reasons we just saw, that quote, right? And by extension then, so if he thinks that's a bad reason, you can see why he even thinks if there is a revolution going on in a country, you should still not invade. And his idea is you should kind of let it play out to see who has the upper hand, whether the current regime, the oppressive regime, or the revolution that wants freedom has the upper hand. And the reason why you should let this play out is because only if there is enough people supporting freedom will this thing work. And, well, you can kind of see how this will go, right? Like, if there's enough people to support the freedom, then they'll win the revolution, and then they don't need you to come in. But if you come in and you tip the balance one way or another, then you can't really find out, and they might actually not have enough people on their side, and so you go in, you kill a bunch of people, you cause a lot of destruction, you put a democracy in place, a couple of months later, back to oppression, and you've just wasted lives, time, energy, money, and so on. So, here's basically the argument if you put it in the way I like to do this. So, if a military intervention is going to be justified, then it must have a reasonable chance of success. That seems to be the underlying idea here, right? Unless this actually will work, don't do it. And that, by the way, is a standard condition in just war theory. So, it's a long, century-old tradition in philosophy of just war theory, thinking about what the ethics of warfare might be. And usually you get a number of these conditions, right? One is proportionality, that the violence should be proportional. So, if there is just a small little troops if you have these barbaric nations, where say like they have 20 people with some spears and shields, and you have an airplane with bombs on it, you can't just you can use that would be way disproportionate, right? That you bomb a whole part of the country to get rid of this small military force. That's not allowed. It's unethical. What you do is you use proportionate force, which is a much lower amount of force than that. That's one of them. Another one that we'll see in a little moment later is necessity. So the idea is that military force is justifiable only if it's necessary, if it's a measure of last resort. So, was the example, Claudia, you made by Austria-Hungary. Russia says we'll intervene on behalf of Austria. Well, in principle, maybe it could be justifiable to intervene then against the Russians, but not if you could use diplomatic means. Right? If you could talk to them and then persuade them that they wouldn't do it, then you can't just go in and start killing people. Right? So you first, only once you've exhausted all the other options can you start using. So there's like these conditions. One of them is they should have a reasonable chance of success. Right? If this is a hopeless mission, you can't just go in and start using violence and so on. All right. So here is a further idea, like a necessary part of an intervention counting as a success is that they actually bring about a free society. Mill seems to be pretty clearly committed to that idea. So then follows, right, so if the intervention is going to be justified, must be a reasonable chance of success of bringing about freedom. But here it goes, right, if not enough people will fight for the freedom, then not enough people will do what is necessary to maintain freedom. That was in that quote, that second quote that we saw, right? If they're not, then there's going to be at some point some knot of conspirators or military leader or whatever grabbing power. And so then follows that if enough people won't fight for the freedom, then intervention cannot be justified. That's roughly the idea. And so, why would this preclude fighting, intervening for domestic revolution? Well, this is if people are actually living under an unfree institution, or are oppressed by domestic forces, and they are not willing to fight for the freedom. That's an empirical premise here. Right? And so therefore the interventions in A and B cannot be just, that's our mistake. Forget, that's just A, should be just A. It's an old. Interventions A would be just the interventions against domestic oppression. I'll correct that before I upload it. Oh no, wait, I'm mistaken. So no. These cases, unfree institutions or oppressed by domestic forces. So regime change or just these domestic revolts. Never mind what I just said. This is fine. No, it's correct. I confused myself. So this is roughly his argument for why an intervention for regime change or an intervention to aid a domestic struggle for freedom is not going to be justifiable. Right? He thinks, well, these are people that are living under these unfree institutions, of this oppression, and if they're not capable by themselves to overthrow it, then they're not capable of supporting a free society anyway. If they're not capable of supporting a free society anyway, then this won't count as success, because success means bringing freedom. Of course, there's a key premise here, right, which is, this is a standard idea of justice in warfare. This is an assumption that Mill makes, that freedom is a good idea, that's part of the goal of a just intervention. Most people accept that these days. This is a more questionable thing, right? So Mill seems to think that willingness to support institutions in peacetime maybe implies willingness to fight for free institutions in wartime, or at least under repression. So this is something that people who disagree with Mill often object to. Right? They say, well, this is a questionable assumption here. Maybe there's a lot of people out there who won't actually pick up arms against an oppressor, but would do the things to support a democratic government once it's put in place. It's an empirical question in some way. Yeah, Jason?
Also, isn't it could be true that the people may be willing but incapable of actually matching the force of their oppressor. For instance, people that talk about going against the U.S. government, whether or not they're justified, good luck. But without some kind of foreign military backing, they're not even going to have to dispatch people. They can drop drones on you before you're going to get within 50 miles of where they are.
Right.
And everything. So everybody could be entirely willing. It doesn't mean that they can do what they need to do to actually enact what they're willing to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's a great point. I've written as much, actually. It's an open question whether willingness to fight is the same as willingness to support, right, institutions. But even if you think that there is some interesting relation between that, and even if you think that this relation was held in the time of Mill, that which is also an open question, it's definitely a further issue whether in a current time of modern warfare technology, whether you could still make this inference. Right? So go to Iraq again, which seems to be at the forefront of my mind today. But the first intervention, which is the George H. Bush, right? Herbert, was it H.W. Bush? Whatever. I always get the initials confused. The older one, right? When he had the no-fly zone over northern Iraq, the idea behind it was the Kurdish people who were resisting in northern Iraq, they don't stand a chance because all that the Hussein regime had to do was just throw the Air Force and just bomb the crap out of them from high up in the sky, and they didn't have the resources to defend themselves. Right? And in those cases, the idea was there was a significant desire among the Kurdish people to live independently and fairly freely. I mean, usually that part of the country has for a long time been one of the more stable and better governed parts within the limits of how far that goes when you're living in a war-torn area, right? But they're overwhelmed, right? And so the idea was to take that military power out of the equation, and then you could hopefully let them achieve their independence and freedom by themselves. The Bush administration also promised they would come in on the ground on behalf of them, and then backed off. Lots of people. That didn't work out well because they anticipated help and it never came. But anyway, but your point is well taken. Yeah. So empirically, this might not be true. Just because it equates fighting for and supporting as the same thing. But it might even less be true once the differences in power, military power between the government and the people get really extreme. Yeah. So, and if that's true, right, then that really pulls the rug out underneath of Mill's argument. Right? So now we have to restart thinking about, okay, well, we still believe that they must have a reasonable chance to succeed, but we can no longer say that if there is no willingness to fight, there is no adequate grounds for supporting free institutions. That could go either way, right? It might mean that we have to allow intervention in more cases, maybe in less cases or the same amount of cases, but we need a different argument.
Could you change it to say that if the people aren't willing to assist whoever it is that they ask for intervention, like if the populace were expecting someone to intervene and do the entire intervention for them and overthrow their government, basically do the work part, they take the loss of life, and then just hand sovereignty back over to the people afterwards. Like, in that instance, it would be understandable to say, like, there's no reason to believe these people are going to do anything to support the democracy once it's installed and everything like that. But it's not going so far as to say, unless everybody's willing to put their life on the line for it, it's not valid.
So what's this? I'm hearing you, but what's the suggestion that you're making now?
Like say the Iraqi people were to ask us for help and we went in, they wouldn't give us any forces to train or take on patrol with us. For instance, when I was in Afghanistan, that's what we spent a large portion of our time doing, was training the Afghan forces so that they could hold the area once we left. Everything, because no one had been able to train them up to that point. If they hadn't been willing to do that, we probably would not have been as adamant to take the area we were in, just because we know that they would have lost it within 2 to 3 months after we left.
Right.
Even with all the training, they ended up losing it again. But the fact that they were willing to come out and actually stand with us and just, basically say, we're asking you for help, not to do the work for us. That seems like it might be a little bit closer to the truth, where you would be kind of like almost wasting your time to go in and do anything if they're not willing to sweat and bleed as well.
Right. Yeah, that I think is a very reasonable way of reinterpreting Mill. Right. So Mill would say, if there is sufficient willingness locally to take on whatever burden they can take on, and there is reason to think that that willingness is enough to actually win the day in the end, then you might have a good case for going in. Of course, there's a really tricky issue about how much you know in advance, right? Right. So that's part of what he's trying to do, right? He's trying to say, well, looking from the outside in, when can I know that there is good enough shot that this will actually work? So if it's just a domestic fight going on, then I don't know, because it could be either side that's going to win, and so I'm going in blind, if you will, right? And he thinks, well, if there is a fight going on, but it's against a foreign oppressor, then even though they might not be winning, that doesn't tell you that there's not enough willingness there, because the foreign oppressor might be so strong, right? And so the suggestion you're now making is, well, maybe that should feed back to the first case, right? You think, well, there's a domestic fight going on, and the people might not be strong enough to actually win, but maybe you should still go in because the military power of the regime might be so strong as to be just like a foreign oppressor. Right? Yeah, and so at the end, we probably won't get to it, but at the end there's a couple of questions, and one question also is, if you think again of the secessionist movements, right? So if there is a smallish group that lives in a larger country, then that smallish group might be weak compared to the larger country. So that even if we just think of countries as sort of one whole thing, which is one type of people in there and so on, then maybe that people as a whole would either be strong enough to overthrow the power or not. But if we have multiple nations or groups of people living in a certain country, and some of them are small and some of them are big, then the small ones might just not have the power to do anything. Right? So in those cases, by Mill's own reasoning, it seems you might actually have a case for intervention. Yeah, say?
So in that case, they'd be able to intervene?
On Mill's argument, it seems like that's the way we should think about it, yeah. So
And that I feel so like
we're suggesting right now that the principles that Mill is using point in the direction of a different conclusion than the one he's drawing, at least today. Probably in his time too, because there's no reason to think that in countries in his time were these one homogeneous single units, right, with no minorities in them and so on. So.
Yeah, would that be like, would that be reasonable for a 10 to 6 there? Since it's like minority versus
Well, in a secessionist case, you would have to split it up, right, and then hope that the new country would have a reasonable chance at being free. So the Kurdish Kurdish people in northern Iraq might have been a case, I don't know today, but at least back in the 90s. The general opinion was that these were people who were they were pretty well organized. They were fairly independent already, and more secular at least than the rest of Iraq was. And so the thought was that if you could get independence for them, that would have a decent shot at being a fairly free and stable country. So they couldn't. Part of the problem was that the Kurds lived both in Turkey and in Iraq, and so if you came in on behalf of independence in Iraq, then fear was the Kurds in Turkey would also want independence, and Turkey was an ally of NATO, and so now the NATO countries can't come in on behalf of the Kurds in Iraq, because an ally is going to get pissed off if they do. So that was part of the strategic problem there. But setting aside that complication, that might have been an example. All right. So, just these are the moral claims. The rest is empirical claims. We've seen that already. All right. Here's where you might actually extend the argument. Why you might even so some of this we've seen already, but you might think that this argument by Mill goes through to an even more radical conclusion. It doesn't, but it'll help us to see it through this way. So think about it this way, right? Like say that justice requires that interventions have a reasonable chance of bringing about a free society. Free societies need the majority of people to support and fight for their freedom. Therefore, interventions can be justified only if the majority of the people is willing to fight for their freedom. However, whenever the majority of the people are willing to fight for their freedom, they can liberate themselves. You might think a little further than that, along million lines, right? Now we've seen already that this might be, well, false, right? But at least if we're taking Mill's word for it, why he's thinking about this the way he is. So then follows that interventions can be justified only if the people can also liberate themselves. However, when the people can liberate themselves, the intervention is not necessary. So it follows that interventions can be justified, at least in light of this first idea here, only when they're not necessary. But like I just said, there's another standard requirement of just wars, that they must be necessary. Violence must be necessary to be justified. And so now it follows that there is no way in which they can be justified, right? If it's necessary, then it cannot be justified because there's not enough chance of success. And if there is enough chance of success, then it cannot be justified because the violence is not necessary anymore. Because now the people will do it by themselves. So it's kind of, you have two principles that are cutting across each other, each ruling out one half of the possible set of interventions. So this, of course, says no justified interventions ever, and that's not what Mill wants to say. So that extended argument can show you why he takes the exceptions that he actually endorses. So one is this. So foreign oppression, right? Let's see, this is the mistake I was talking about. But anyway, the C and the D, but don't care about that. So it says the people the most attached to freedom, the most capable of defending and making good use of their free institutions, may be unable to contend successfully for them against the military strength of another nation much more powerful. So that's the point we were just discussing. Right? Foreign oppressor might be so much more powerful that the people don't stand a chance to fight against it. So to assist a people thus kept down is not to disturb the balance of forces on which the permanent maintenance of freedom in a country rests, as it would be, he thinks, in a domestic fight, right? But to redress that balance when it is unfairly and violently disturbed. Right? So he thinks the outsiders come in, there's this big force keeping the people down. When you remove that, you're not messing with the domestic situation. You're just freeing it up to take its course. Now, of course, after you do that, he thinks you shouldn't do also then the regime change in institution building and so on, right? Then you should just let the people decide for themselves. And if that means they fall back into unfree or oppressive situations, too bad. But at least you remove the thing that was making sure there was no chance at all. But if there's enough support, then it'll actually it'll take care of itself. So that's one exception. It's one exception to the argument. He thinks you don't know, you can't, there's no way freedom can actually have any chance of success if there is an outside force. And then the second one is this protracted civil war, right, where the parties keep each other in a bloody balance. And so basically these are cases where that premise is false, right, the empirical premise, that the people cannot liberate themselves, even though they're willing to support freedom. And Jason's point earlier was, well, if Mill thinks that, then maybe they should allow an additional exception, which is just in these domestic struggles, because it could be a small group, it could be that the military power the difference between it is so extreme. And so. All right. So much of this argument is a pragmatic argument, right? It's an argument about how will this actually have a chance of working out. Right? It's not an argument about self-determination. It's not an argument about sovereignty. Right? It's an argument about what's the goal here. It's this, to bring about a democracy or popular institutions, to have the people govern themselves. And intervention can be justified to do that, he thinks, but only in very limited cases. Only when there is an outside force that's overwhelming the people and making it impossible for them to govern themselves. Or if there's these groups that are just fighting in an ongoing way and that won't actually stop ever, so there won't actually be a moment or an opportunity for a type of free society to develop. And then you can stop that too and try and create that moment. All right. Here are a couple of questions you might take home to think about, and I'll stop. So, questions about the empirical premises. We've seen this already, right? So, does freedom require majority support? That's something you can ask yourself. Seems plausible, right? We know many places where democratic constitutions have been put in place, but they aren't exactly. That doesn't exactly mean that they immediately turn into these vibrant democracies. Certain Latin American countries, I believe Argentina, for example, tried in the early 20th century pretty much to make sort of a carbon copy of the U.S. Constitution. Not exactly, but the Constitution was very directly based on the U.S. Constitution. And sort of during the 20th century, when the Peron government came in, you got a type of military fascist regime, and it's hardly been a flourishing democracy since. Not the worst country in the world, right? But not a flourishing democracy. And so, one possible explanation, I don't know if this is the explanation for Argentina, but one possible explanation would be that the support is not there. Right? Well, you should ask yourself, is that correct description of the case of Argentina or many other cases like it? Because a lot hinges on that for Mill. If popular support really isn't the thing that is making the difference between these cases and the successes, then the argument doesn't go through. Right. Well, we've talked about this. Right? Mill thinks that if you don't have a very forceful resistance going on, a resistance strong enough to overthrow the government, then you can assume that there's not enough support for freedom. Is that true? And then this one is whether there's really a difference between domestic and foreign oppressors. That's a point that Desson, for example, also stresses, right? Desson thinks, just like you were suggesting, saying, look, you can have a domestic oppressor that is just as powerful as a foreign oppressor compared to the people. And then this argument doesn't go through. All right, well, think about this when you go home. We'll end a little early. See you on Thursday. Exam time, blue book. You can bring your notes, and so on.